Self-Mastery by David SEABURY. Audiobook edition 2023 by David DeAngelis. All rights are reserved. Nature is at work. Character and destiny are her handiwork. She gives us love and hate, jealousy and reverence. All that is ours is the power to choose which impulse we shall follow. David SEABURY, foreword. Few people seem to realize that many, if not most, of the problems they encounter in life stem from the fact that they are unable to get along with themselves. The basic situation appears to be that they do not recognize the powerful impact the various emotions have on the way we think and act. Emotions are valuable in the sustaining and enjoyment of life, but untrained and not properly directed, they can create chaos in everyday living. Throughout his colorful career as a spiritual psychologist, his writings and lectures have had a profound impact on the American way of life. Dr. SEABURY consistently emphasized the necessity of the individual recognizing his complex nature. Man is an emotional, mental, and spiritual being, and unless and until he recognizes these three aspects of his nature and discovers how to have them harmonize with each other, difficulties will be encountered. However, by paying close attention to these three factors, nurturing them, and carefully controlling them, a self-mastery can be achieved, which will open up a wonderful new experience in living. Willis Kinnear. Chapter 1. Discover yourself. Is there a miracle about you? That is not a foolish question. It needs an answer. If a moment is taken to consider the question carefully, there will come to anyone's mind the recognition that, yes, there is something very close to evidence of a miracle in a human being, if not proof positive. The unfulfilled possibilities in a human organism strongly suggest a greater extension of our ability to express life than we have yet fully shown. There are many other indications that there are ways of solving man's inner problems if we can be persuaded to contribute some of our time to acquiring knowledge about how to use them for our own benefit. How many of us have yielded ourselves to a careful estimation of what our thoughts actually mean and do to us and to life? Are they cheerful or gloomy? Generous or stingy? Do they contribute to health by their relaxed faith in life or get us so uptight that the blood cannot flow comfortably? The breath does not feel free. A cold grips the respiratory system. It is not too hard to fill out the list. Psychology has delved into a study of human reaction from numerous angles. But in listing the extraordinary reach of man's endowments, the larger number of researchers have cautiously skirted the greatest promise of all in a human being's deeper urges, the knowledge and foresight of the human soul. What, for instance, keeps a person out of jail? A combination of the meanings and realizations of certain of his attributes, his intelligence, his power of choice, and the realization of his soul. The latter element especially because it is the most keenly aware of values. It can feel most convincingly the dreadfulness of being jailed and the unfairness of subjecting humanity to the crushing load of trying to find an answer to the destructive effect of evil action on life and everybody in it. Understanding of man's full nature and capacities is catching up with the effectiveness of scientific discoveries. However, there is now some chance of outdistancing the remarkable contributions of science. Though the task will not be easy for the goal in view, of freeing the human soul from the bondage of a negatively conditioned ego, it has as its main hurdle, not inanimate matter to deal with as the scientist does, but millions of individual souls. And all of these must consent to assist in trying to discover the best and most rewarding use of their own individual natures. Will they be willing to do this? Quite possibly if the advantage to themselves, by liberation from the heavy weight of neurosis, becomes clear enough for them to see that there is an incalculable gain for them and for the world. For we badly need to know what we are dealing with when faced with the negative power of emotion and the misplaced ingenuity of the ego. Simplification can often bring to light the kernel of even complex tasks. It is being proved that people can do themselves a world of good by choosing two particular factors from the psychology of humanity and getting more useful understanding of the special significance in their relationship. The first of these two factors is emotion and its wonderful and dreadful power, and the second is the ego, which has so many remarkable methods and techniques to make a good life for the individual. However, The ego spoils much of the value of its own offerings because we have not as yet much more than a smattering of knowledge of what trouble the ego can cause. If a person refuses to learn to distinguish between the sound types of assistance his ego can provide and the distorted and often neurotic varieties it too often offers instead, he can be constantly led into errors, from silly gaffes to terrible trouble. Human consciousness is continually pelted with negative suggestions, prompting foolish or dangerous attitudes and reactions in all of us. These poor choices of attitude and reaction can settle themselves in the ego as habits of mind with their troublesome results. Being what we might aptly call the realistic representative of human consciousness, whose main job is to concern itself with our everyday needs, the ego is called upon to guide us in our ordinary choices and run-of-the-mill habits. But it is forever subservient to the emotions. It has its own share of intelligence, and a good share. But it does not have a chance against an aroused burst of rage, for instance, unless the door of consciousness and the processes of the mind are kept open for contact with the higher elements of the mind and spirit. The factor of instinct has many forms of awareness of truths that can produce well-being for the individual. That is its prime contribution to the safety of human life. It attracts our attention to ways and means of protecting our lives, and even of prodding the imagination to bring to mind methods and ingenuities that finally started the race off on its incredible journey toward today's technology. This again brings us back to the miraculous promise involved in human nature. Nothing seems to have been left out that would be needed in the development of a superior race. Two things were left in that are so powerful, so developmental in either direction, good or bad, that we are not having too easy a time to get them in hand and to see to it that they stop interfering with our enjoyment and success. We need to discover how to turn this Niagara of force toward the improved use of every one of the gifts that have been freely handed to us. We refer, of course, to the giant power, emotion, and to the clever ingenuity of the ego. So there cannot be much doubt about the value of knowing more about what place emotion holds in life, and whether or not we should give it more space in stretching our concept of education. No aspect of life as we know it could be more dangerous to neglect. For without our being fully aware of it, emotion is a powerhouse without equal to develop our miraculous talents for the increased enjoyment of all, or for destroying each other. The ego has an extraordinary facility for dealing with the more immediate problems of life, and naturally needs specific instruction not to waste its efforts on questionable tricks, when training for success is what it needs. After all, why deny that we are more important to ourselves than anything else in existence? It is not only true, but necessary. We should be attentive to our value, or we could make a worse botch of our lives than we do. For what we might carelessly believe to be mere self-love is mainly self-protection, necessary to a race if it is to succeed and evolve. A first need, however, would be to work out how we can balance this primal interest in the self with assured interest in the other fellow. For he, according to our own admission of the necessity for self-regard, must be excused for also being interested in his own needs and protections. It was here that the thought of man as a miracle suggested itself. For a miracle can adjust to any need if that need is understandable. It is not too hard to see that going no further than the human body we are in the presence of a miracle. With all the wealth of our factual data, which, put together, explains the human body, there remains a mystery that in all fairness we must admit suggests the realm of the miraculous. Why does the heart go on and on? How is it that the body can separate the elements of food and distribute them where they are needed? How does medicine get to where the flesh is suffering and come up with a surcease from pain? We blandly accept it all, and then proceed to abuse the body by neglecting to take charge of our emotions. In this day of overemphasis on the study of matter, we should reinstate interest in the pursuit of knowledge about our inward selves. We need a more particular kind of wisdom in relation to self-understanding, a workable awareness of the meaning of our spontaneous, sometimes very disturbing reactions, and those of others. We should begin to become more adept at recognizing the difference between natural human identity reactions and the kind of reactions that are contaminated by emotional experiences causing neurotic feelings, which then begin to settle into neurotic habits. For example, self-pity is a neurotic feeling. How could it be normal when it is declaring that an individual, whose main drive is to increase the expansion, the development of his own relation to life, is a pitiful, abused being. Such an attitude makes no sense, we say. But it could do so, could it not, if it were caused by accusations made by adults in whose power a child, as well as he can judge, finds himself to be placed? He is in no position to win over an adult, not until he is well grown and has picked up some basic knowledge of the what and why of such a common human reaction as self-pity. It is detrimental to an extreme degree, for a person's experience can be wasted in a kind of mourning over his estimation of his own value. This can lay waste his efforts to gain self-expansion by his arbitrary disbelief in that possibility for him. It will help in reducing the friction that is sure to follow the actions of disorderly emotions if we realize that neurosis is much like an inflamed sore irritating the individual. It can be cured, and it will become easier to maintain patience and hope for its cure if we will take this fact as a worthwhile belief. Average neurosis can be self-treated and cured if a person is willing to come to an understanding of a few fairly simple principles. If anyone wanting to be free of his neurotic reactions, taken on in ignorance of how neurotic infection starts, will accept a paramount principle that life is a process which must be learned, he can win a good life. He can vastly improve his emotional experiences if he is willing to learn life instead of blundering from mistake to mistake because he will not study his own reactions and interpret them in relation to the increasing knowledge of their meanings. Only by building and, when necessary, rebuilding our habits to obtain constructive help from our handling of life can we even ask to attain self-expansion, for in the end, it is nothing more or less than self-mastery. It seems that at this point we have put a finger on the factor, the activity, and the most enigmatic influence of the ego. For only the ego seems to represent man against God, or it may be more exact to say, man in competition with God. The ego is rightfully dedicated to serving humanity's central drive, which is self-expansion, the development of the human being and his enjoyment of life. But what an interesting outcome it could be if the emotions were freed from their ignorant urge to hold life in neurotic stalemate. By understanding and discarding neurotic habits, we could prevent neurosis from endlessly holding emotion in static servitude to its own lower levels of fury, terror, lust, and rank inquisitiveness. An inquiry in this direction might offer some relief to man's labored musings on who he is and what he is for. For instance, what was in the mind of the one who declared that man shall not live by bread alone? Certainly, this declaration must have been inspired by a belief that man had further interests than just to fill his stomach and glut his sensations. If we have any claim to a touch or more of charm, it will come from the quantity and quality of our emotions and how we express them. The very heaven or hell of our life experience is molded from our emotional reactions. If we cannot use and not abuse the force of basic rage, the higher expression of which is courage, we will be apt to be in hot water a large proportion of our life. If we get a notion that fear is just a discomfort, or maybe a disgrace, we will perhaps never be able to train it into the caution and good judgment it is capable of offering us. If we cannot raise lust to its more glorious expression of love, we can, according to present statistics, end up with a contagion which could deplete the power of our miracle of a body to stave off physical illness. And if we disrespectfully disregard the strength of wonder, which is interest in life and a desire to learn, we have put a sadly obstructive blockage on the chance we have of enjoying the life we purport to be interested in. In this exciting age, we need to venture more deeply and widely into the invisible world of what we passionately feel but cannot physically see, the realm of emotion where the fate of our lives is largely decided. We have not yet accepted on a practical basis the fact that we can tell our emotions where to get off when they throw us into tizzies that shoot our blood pressure up, put our digestion out of order, and open us up to the contagion of the common cold. When a troublesome or dangerous emotional response is allowed to happen over and over, we are helpless to prevent its consequences. This unhappy fact is a natural element of the human equation. But new habits can be formed to take the place of old ones to free us from this constant discomfort. Such new habits can fortify our power over our emotions and reduce the chance of their having unskilled power over us. We are not going to tell you that the causes of the more explosive examples of this mastery of an individual by his own emotions will conveniently disappear overnight. But we will freely say that those who have experienced their first victory over the battle of the ego get a sense of triumph that is apt to be larger than expected. This area of success ultimately brings more of a thrill than many objective victories. As a matter of fact, this type of winning over our emotions, which over and over trap us into reactions that reveal ineptitude rather than self-mastery, is proof of that very thing, self-mastery. And the latter is as good as money in that realm where hard cash will get you nowhere. In still too large a number of us, rage, fear, lust, and prying meddlesomeness are still much too eager to burst out and start either confusion or a battle of some kind. Rather than aimlessly asking the doubtfully productive question, "What can I do to help?" we can really contribute something by taking a good look at how well we handle our own emotions. That is really the hopeful area where we can give some genuine help to struggling life. And as said above, success in this effort can carry a thrill that, once fairly evaluated, can surpass the temporary victories of objective life. Knowledge is one of the most precious commodities anyone, any race, any nation can own. But because of its very importance and the remarkable and varied capacities the human race displays, it is too easy to grab a bit of important knowledge here, another bit there, and to find ourselves confused by their multitude and the difficulties involved in relating them. The aim of this book, then, is to take up three of the central factors in everybody's life. The first is about what is called the ego, the clever, very active agent in human consciousness, which is gifted with the skills necessary to keep the various aspects of this complicated organism related to each other, aware of each other, and all working together to attain that deeply desired goal of self-expansion. For that universal desire means the development into the most successful use of every talent and purpose the individual may be endowed with. Second is the powerful dynamic engine of emotion, which keeps the whole accumulation of abilities running, colors the many varieties of personality, and with whatever mistakes it makes is still the element that makes life interesting and worth living. And last, but by no means least, is the capacity to think functionally. That is, to hang on to the coattails of the darting ego and bring a species of order into its electric activity. Thinking functionally, being spontaneously able to apply more awareness of how cause and effect relate to each other in our lives, could untangle many tight knots humanity is struggling to untie. Function is a peculiarly important word, but it has not, until recently perhaps, been thought of in its specific value to the thinking of the average person. It has long been used by the scientists, mathematicians, and those who expect to use their minds to their best possible function to help them in their chosen work. As a matter of fact, effective function can be used to excellent effect by average people if they can brush off their awe of the specially trained mind and recognize that all of us can develop a better functioning of our thought processes with added benefit to our lives. A mind that functions well is a gift straight from heaven, but because we are miracles, overabundantly gifted by life, there are other powerful elements in humanity that must be brought into as good final function as the mind. The most disturbingly powerful of all is human emotion. It is of a different nature than the mind, but the latter must cooperate with it smoothly if we are to escape from that demon conflict, emotional and mental strife, which can sap the strength of a Hercules. How shall we do it? Not certainly by refusing to consider the matter. We can learn a great deal about ourselves, how our minds and emotions work, what causes them to act contrary to our ultimate best interests, how to recognize the mishandling of emotion which is sure to end in trouble that could be avoided, and perhaps most of all, how to react to an untrained ego which too often seeks personal self-expansion by any means, at any price. Chapter 2. Demons and Delights. As we now know, the mind must produce images to stir the will into action, and it certainly needs them to get the lively human impulses of rage, fear, sex, and greed into better command. We need to know that these demon impulses may most surely become the delights of our lives when transmuted into energy, caution, love, and wonder. They are elusive but blatantly obvious, too, in their various forms of power and intent. Asterisk. They all have recognizable manifestations of demon and delight, and these are difficult to conceal from other people, which is a crucial inconvenience, at least in the case of the demons. The ego, in its constant use of these emotions for the purpose of gaining self-expansion, recognizes them as prime assistants in its plans for imposing its will on life and other people. Unfortunately, the ego has not yet fully given up its belief in going to war, if necessary, to assure its owner a secure success in self-development. The ego is avid for quick triumphs, instead of the saner and safer way of placing a well-planned image of growth in the mind for the will to use as a steady guide for success. The ego prefers faster methods, spurred on by a trick or two to put any opposition at a disadvantage. These demons and delights, then, are nothing more nor less than our two-faced emotions. Spurred on by the ego, the supreme master of ceremonies, they can get us into all kinds of trouble from ugly moods, insinuating criticism and blame of others. Then, suddenly, these emotions will turn their angelic side outward and bring joy and gladness into life. Unfortunately, it can be a trick for a purpose, rather than genuine good nature. There is something a bit weird about the way human emotion can bounce from fury to timidity, from terror to loving consideration. A person's mood can whirl from gentleness to someone he loves dearly to an unbelievable burst of what is convincingly like hatred. So, we should be ready for anything and learn to keep our temper if we wish to survive the ingenious methods the ego is capable of. But there is a part of our nature we can depend upon for fair play. When the ego is working for self-expansion for its host, it is not altogether interested in fair play. But it can be subdued and will give up an unfair battle if it meets a combination of intelligence and confidence in the other person's motives. Suppose a young couple, recently engaged, find themselves in the midst of a violent quarrel because the young man was caught by the girl kissing an attractive young woman whom she had never seen or heard of before. What do we have to deal with here? One of the common, but very common bad habits of human life: emotionally distorted assumption. False assumption is common coin in the world of human emotion. In an instant, deep fear floods this poor girl's mind, for she loves the guy. And then, in their seemingly helpless duel with their areas of strong feeling, rage rises like a tidal wave and engulfs the two struggling souls in their own emotions until they hardly recognize each other. This kind of small drama, quite often ending tragically, happens again and again, putting human beings through dreadful spasms of pain which rack their bodies and terrify their minds. And all because of what? An unproved assumption. The strange girl the young man was kissing, and whom he had recently met, was a cousin who lived on the opposite side of the country on the West Coast, and had come unexpectedly to visit the young man's family in the East. If this young girl, when these two became engaged, had had some realization of the human problem of false assumption which happens every day, and of its physical shock from emotional reaction, she might have done a little useful homework. She might have built a retaining wall around her love by quizzing herself as to whether or not she trusted the young man's honesty and faithfulness. If she could not say yes enthusiastically, she would have better faced the fact that a certain amount of bliss would be lacking in her marriage. She might have acknowledged to herself that life was too great to be just an afternoon tea, and that she would be wise to give some respectful study to the handling of her emotions and the stabilizing of her belief in her fiancé. The lower levels of the human emotions, if allowed to function without reasonable need, will produce only a sheer waste of energy by often using methods that will force the results supposedly desired into their exact opposites. Success is seldom obtained by rousing the primitive forces of rage or fear, or both, in anyone. It is an almost certain signal for conflict which can push the result in either direction, for or against the aggressor, and that wastes valuable time. At the least, it is more apt to threaten success than bring it about. Anyway, it will add disturbing complications. In a person who is insulted without just cause, rage rises instantly. It is possible to suppress one's rage, but it takes strength to do it, and it causes a reduction in energy in the person attacked. This is surely a defeat, not a victory. We cannot suppress our emotions without losing energy, but we can persuade our emotions if we will make friends with them. This can be done by becoming acquainted with their natural ways of reacting. But first, it is advisable to know something about what the ego is up to in its passionate pursuit of self-expansion for its owner. It can indeed do him a serious injury by flattering him into attempting a life occupation that is quite unsuitable to both his talents and his really deep desires. Someone may say, I didn't know I could flatter myself. Of course he can. The ego is a past master of such chicanery. If the truth be told, the ego is not very intelligent in the deeper sense. It is often more clever than intelligent. Instinct is its rival in that regard, though more limited in the detail of its facilities. Its field being self-survival, it must guard the person's life, and it cannot be too choosy in its methods. So, it wisely permits basic wisdom to contribute to its need. Many intelligent individuals shy away from panting after the position of top dog because they are smart enough to recognize that, though fame is fun, it can turn a person's life into a kind of public property. This realization may lead to another, that a less arduous public bondage can bring a person a wholesome comfort and enjoyment of life, if less notability. The art of working out just where one belongs in life may turn out to be one of the most popular. It might require a knockdown, drag-out battle with the ego, and this realization may lead to another, that the ego must stop its flattering whimsies and open up its bag of subtle ingenuities to the guiding genius of mankind's great power, the power of choice. The ego has been too little understood, and emotion has been too blandly accepted as a road to pleasure. They have both been largely overlooked as fully open-throttled forces which need smart steering and braking. Thus, we must be willing to concede the ego's goal as important, although its score on the bullseye of wise action is far from high. The fault cannot justly be laid wholly on the ego itself, for it has been assigned a specific job among the many tasks, visible and invisible, that have been invented and constructed by the great designer to provide the human being with the ability to live life. What is needed is a combined effort of the whole human structure to discover what life is and how it is meant to work, guided by a wisdom-endowed soul. There is a dire need to acquire more knowledge of life at the level of emotional reaction, with more attention put on any inadequately handled power of emotion. Also, the ego should be guided into being a more knowing servant of life for the individual. Heaven knows it is eager enough, but it needs a few hints about ethical practices, and it would not do the world any harm for the ego to forbear a bit with the eagerness and look into the matter of the ethical. Anyone in reasonable possession of his senses will admit that each of us arrives in life in an almost complete state of ignorance. Not quite complete, however. The immediate, most eager search for the mother's breast by the infant is basic instruction to us that there is spontaneous though undeveloped knowledge in the newborn child. This proved reality of the force and simple intelligence of instinct strongly suggests that there may be a long list of urges and invitations to action that, if given a prod or two by attention, could help this little humanly shaped creature to have a good life. Surely, centrally important would be forming in his attitudes and habit patterns a conviction which would train the ego not to put all its money on seeking its successes by an utter ignoring of injury to others. How indeed could its results possibly fail to interrupt the movement of the primitive force of the emotions toward primitive impulses rather than civilized ones? We need more precise awareness of the tricks our emotions play on us, and willingness to take some pains to forestall the devastation they can bring to an individual, a community, the world, not to mention life in general. If we accept this job, we are doing life a good turn, but everything we do for the good of life ultimately returns to us in advantages to ourselves. It is the only guarantee of really dependable peace, personal, national, and international. It sounds like a big job, and it is. And yet, relief from neurotic miseries can begin almost immediately in small ways and increase to greater and greater relief as ignorance of the effect of our own emotional reactions is cleared away. To learn what one is doing that is destructive rather than constructive in any area of living is the first step in gaining a chance to establish sound habits. And sound habits in every one of the processes of life guarantee protection from the misuse of our incredible force of feeling. We are fortunate that to a considerable number of human beings, thanks to wise parents, the best expression of the emotions, such as courage, good judgment, kindness, and interest in life at its highest level, appeals so compellingly that they are willing to persuade their egos to adjust their methods to such goals. There are indeed a large number of people who have constantly lent themselves to building up the practice of courageous, well-judged, considerate, and enthusiastic attitudes and beliefs. They have settled them firmly in their minds, which then, under the law that The will obeys the image in the mind, induce corresponding action in daily experience. So the evidences of the possibility of advance in civilization are already proved, but we have not fully faced the strength of emotion and the power of its control. It is the primary boss of the human being, with a potent pull toward self-indulgence in every realm where temptation is present. And surely we must admit that it is ever present. We speak of a child as innocent, and smile indulgently when it is caught watching to escape detection and then darting its hand into a candy or cookie jar. And it is indeed innocent. It is merely ignorant of the structure of life. It has to be taught to see that the success or failure of life is based in principles that are at the command of human choice. The very obvious conclusion is that a human being's power of choice is an irreplaceable factor in his success or failure, his health or illness, his pleasure or pain. Can we truthfully deny that choice is a deeply fundamental producer of the history of our lives? Learning has been appreciated in many areas on this circling globe, but has it been effectively valued? Have its conveniences and safeguards, its gifts and pleasures, its protections and comforts really been understood and admitted? Understanding and admission of values in life have been pretty well mangled by man's confusion about the action of his own powers. And unfortunately, the ego is vastly to blame for our failure to recognize the threat in its success at any price attitude, but only for its owner. That attitude contains the germ of delay in straightening out the communion of men who struggle patiently to work out solutions for individual conflicts and world threats. A human being finds himself, when he enters adolescence and the teens, in a strange situation. His thinking is beginning to take on a disconcerting aspect. It is talking to him in a way it has not exactly done before. It is beginning to ask him rather odd questions, to which he cannot easily find answers. What does school mean to him? Would he go if he were not automatically forced to by law and perhaps not fully explained insistence of his parents? But he finds that his contemporaries accept the situation as unavoidable, so he falls into the lure of the consensus of his fellows and allows himself to follow the pattern. He may argue a bit with his parents, but their astonishment, even irritation, at any quibbling about getting an education sobers him down. They may even ask, "Do you want to be a dunce?" That settles it. Naturally, he doesn't want to be a dunce. But the buzzing questions in his thought go on, and he begins to feel somehow like a stranger in a strange land. The social habits carry him along, however. His pals are with him in the new life process, and he plods along acceptingly until the first high school report card. It is not very satisfactory. Mother temporizes, but father demands, "What gives? No son of mine is going to have nothing better than a D grade in school." Here is a simple bit of evidence of the action patterns of the chronologically but not mentally adult ego. It is father's ego that feels disgraced. He suffers. In his pain, he hits out. Mother's blind love for her firstborn comes to the fore in her reaction. That is why she is willing to temporize. She must drop oil on the threat of turbulent waters ahead, although she is uncomfortable at the idea her son might fail. Her ego does not want to face Mrs. Plimpton, whose Jimmy is quite bright. He gets mostly A's. So the family is steeped in gloom, and son is bemused with confusion. He studied his lessons. At least he feels as though he had. But the praise given him by the coach during football practice last season simmers in his mind and diminishes his feeling that the unsatisfactory marks given him for his schoolwork should get everybody so steamed up. He feels unhappy and discouraged, and hunts around in his mind for some way to place himself in a better position with his father and mother, who plainly show their disappointment. Fear then attacks his self-image and reduces his self-confidence to almost zero. He ponders the situation anxiously. His mind goes blank. He loses touch with his urge for self-expansion. Will he ever be any good at anything? There does not seem to be much chance. This is a typical example of people trying to fit themselves into family life with the two age levels of parents and children, the one somewhat overpowered by its obligation to bring the children up, and the other going through its own obligations in the midst of a welter of demands, physical, mental, amorous, and ambitious. It is quite a demand on both levels, and many are the misunderstandings and tribulations that keep interrupting the family peace and comfort. It may seem strange to declare that the ego is far from being the most appetizing element of the human personality, and that in truth it threatens the best interests of the individual in some of the most important areas of his life. For instance, the egotist, he who is in abject enslavement to his ego, is seriously hampered from becoming effectively acquainted with the deeper qualities of his own full identity. He pushes too hard for success in all things. Then when failures begin to show up, he starts resisting life and too often threatens his own ability to succeed by substituting bad habits for good. The greatest cause of failure in dealing with humanity's ills is a stubborn defense of egotism. Egotism is forever fastening its attention on circumstances that cannot be controlled and overlooking those that can. It refuses in particular to examine any ideas that threaten its sense of familiarity in the neurotic state. Many of us do not carry thought far enough to recognize that immediate success in all things would stultify anyone. For initial natural failures are instructive. They can teach patience, better concentration of attention, and provide assistance to the power of the will in its job of obeying the images of desires or plans a person gathers in his own mind for ultimate accomplishment. Misled by a dangerous inattention to consequences, personalized pride in achievement and vanity concerning his prowess will come to seem perfectly logical to many an ambitious person. To give them up in order to examine the consequences for any dangerous results would feel like surrendering his very self. We must admit that the ego is up a tree in this perplexity. All it wants, so it believes, is to serve the person it inhabits with its best efforts to make good. It believes its purpose to be one and single. The truth is that along with its legitimate desire to help its owner with the many needs for adjustment in communal life, it is profoundly tempted by personal power, and often works harder for possession of that power than in attaining skill in the use of the power of choice. From the plentiful gathering of life urges and beliefs in the miracle of a human organism, one part of the organism may attempt to break off from the whole and rule the rest. This is an example of those almost incomprehensible vagaries of psychosis, insanity, when the person appears to be governed by a static belief that is not understandable by others, such as in unreasonable insistence that he is Julius Caesar, or Genghis Khan, or whoever may have made a huge success in life. So we can easily see that a desire for success that is so misguided as to be clear out of sanity can bring a person enough trouble to neutralize his successes. Can we not even see in this proven type of mental breakdown a practical value having a reasonable degree of knowledge of the dangers the trained ego can present? Knowledge in our head will do us and life little good unless that knowledge relates to how we, as citizens of our country and the world, make use of it. And the ego is loaded with misconceptions that fail us when we try to treat them as truth. It takes action based on interest to learn how to arm ourselves against allowing excessive emotion to take over our lives. Excessive emotion, coupled with the arch-confuser, inadequate understanding of the way the force of emotion can control us to our own disadvantage, is very clearly the main precipitator of neurotic habits. But improving the accuracy of our attitudes can definitely and importantly refute the power emotion has to cause us unnecessary suffering, all too often ending in poor health. So, the education of the emotions is the effective lever necessary to rid life of the torments we bring upon ourselves by ignoring the great need of this most basic knowledge. Without it, we cannot expect a new generation to escape malformation of its effective nature. We need to know more about ourselves. We can make good use of the ego's facility in recognizing our need for help in handling day-by-day common experience. It makes us more comfortable and successful in taking care of social, domestic, and business situations. But the ego is too often unwilling to admit that it has only what we might call its age group knowledge of the powerhouse that emotion represents. This limits its capacity to handle life experience in a fully successful way. Careful observance of the activity of human beings leads us to believe that the ego is a great kidder. It is a manipulator of self-interest. It is an ingratiating sympathizer in many time-consuming and doubtfully constructive ways. In a word, the ego is the craftiest campaigner of them all, and it is for what would seem to be a legitimate purpose, support of the individual's self-expansion, the development of his or her value as a person, and a contributor to life's well-being. To deal with the demands life presents to our instantaneous emotional reactions, we need the governing power of a combination of intelligence and generosity, the wisdom-love combination which together makes conscience possible. Conscience, or as I think it is more accurately defined, conscience with knowing, is the glory of human consciousness. For in bringing love and wisdom together as arbitrators in a person's thought, feeling, and action, they bypass the over-greedy desires of the ego with its too often carelessly conceived decisions and actions. Respect for the protection to life of the love-wisdom attitude frees the individual to begin to think ahead of himself, as it were, in a forward-moving rather than a sedentary way. Chapter 3. Recognize your nature. It is astonishing to realize how persistently the general thought of the present age has come to be fixed upon the word ego as describing all that a human being is. This ever-present term has come close to being taken as the one inclusive name for man himself. But as a matter of fact, this thing called ego is much less dependable and admirable than other aspects of our natures. It does not have the down-to-earth guidance of instinct on the one hand, or the regenerative reach of the soul on the other, and this is leaving out a pretty large slice of what a human being has to offer. No doubt about it, we live in a very complex world, full of complex people whose potentialities scorn limitation and reach over into a realm containing experience that moves persistently past objective realities into areas of feeling, knowing, and understanding. In other words, people who live in a world with no objective cues, a world of consciousness utterly barren of solid stuff. So here we are in a world that seems to end really nowhere, suffering from its childish mistakes and out-of-balance beliefs. But it is more and more becoming clear that something needs to be clarified for us, something we have seriously misunderstood. The ego is a part of human consciousness, that dread and fascinating awareness the human being must live with every moment, trying to sort out the welter of demands it makes on his understanding, from rage to terror to physical bliss, to awe and despair with the confusions of life. The ego sees that we must try to adjust our personal desires to the wide needs of life, as well as the narrow, more specific needs of our own natures. The ego has taken on this demanding job in relation to what it sees as its duty to feed the human hunger for self-expansion. As anyone can see, it is a large order and is constantly thrown out of balance by differences in the natural responses to life from person to person. The ego's instinctive goal is self-preservative, and survival must be its accepted interest. There is a natural consensus about this goal of the right to life, and whatever is needed to sustain it. This need is recognized in the family, the community, and the country, but it requires developing from race to race. However, because of the creative power of the near-miracle factor, in man, there will of necessity be a multiplicity of dangers of collision due to the types and degrees of understanding. And these must be resolved daily. But the means for the protection and maintenance of a right to live do not leap up in front of everyone of their own accord, just because they are needed. We are required to stir around, collect them, improve them, and put them into practice. This, in its very obviousness, was recognized by man as he set about thinking out schemes of living and began to put them into operation. It is certainly the basic need for humanity and should be worked on constantly as an accepted ground plan for any sane community. The ego, in fact, is not very grown up and displays rather too much interest in plots and plans that will support man's secret passion for guaranteed power. So it is not really the safest, most intelligent, or forward-looking way to think of the ego as representing all that we are, or to trust it always to give us dependable guidance. The ego is like a nimble secretary who is good in methods of getting along with the world, but will never adequately succeed as the boss of a miracle. In fact, its ability even in learning how to handle worldly demands is daily disturbed and limited by a constant uprush from our subconscious minds, bringing into the present moment the haunt of old fears, disappointments, anger at injustices, loneliness, and other hazards of experience. This cannot help but influence one's attitudes, one's actions, and one's reactions. As an example of how the ego builds up a savings account of miserable memories, let us take a loved and reasonably well-treated child who, after missing his mother for a number of days, rushes to meet her on her return only to find her carrying into the home a strange bundle which gurgles and waves tiny hands. The older child is expected to love and treat kindly this interloper from the moment of its arrival. Is this not apt to be a rather startling demand? Would not every one of his basic emotions be jerked into resistive action and overwhelm his ability to remain utterly calm? After all, he was sure he was the important person in the household. His ego is aroused by the insult. He had had a pretty satisfactory position to be forced to step down from in the wink of an eye, especially if he is 3 and not 30. Various disturbing reactions will surely start to form in his consciousness. Is it not natural for some, if not all, of these intense inner feelings to be very adverse to this new threatening creature being fawned upon by his parents? We cannot expect him to be able to gauge mother's satisfaction in her accomplishment or father's relief at getting mother back home safe and sound. The probability is that this infant's ego for the first time with any real intensity begins to take on suspicions of an insecurity in his existence, and the fear it induces is sharper and more threatening than any falls and bumps he has so far experienced. He rushes to the baby, pinches it and scratches its face. It wails, and a sharp blow lands on our hero's cheek. He does not understand. Why should he? He has merely acted upon the command of his ego. No one has mentioned that word to him yet, let alone prepared him for its painful part in this worldwide drama. He can only rage and sob. Then fear of further punishment instinctively warns him to stifle his rage. His ego, young as it is, advises him to become sly. He stops sobbing, runs and picks up one of his toys and becomes very busy with it, ignoring his former gods. But do not think he is not brooding and plotting. The tricks of the trade, typical of the ego, have begun to surrender to fear. He does not, of course, really know what he is doing or why, but in his ill-equipped self, as far as interpretation of life goes, he is becoming conditioned, frightened by confusion, but answering to the impulse and the practice of fight. He feels helpless but compelled by aroused emotion to act in a world now full of doubt and threat. The ego is turning sour and is on a collision course toward ultimate cynicism. In other words, it is polluting the expectations of the child with fear about his own value. The primary demand of his nature for self-expansion has taken a mortal blow, and the ego is already plotting how to meet this danger to his self-esteem and get his throne back. This process is proceeding in sense images, of course, not in words. But let no one think it is not setting up habits of reaction and belief that will play upon his nature and produce results that are apt to be bad-tempered, but with luck and some kindly explanations from mother and father, can be harmless. If he does not get reasonable help with this primal episode, however, it can give him a shove towards sullenness, if not habituated bitterness. His ego needs instruction, not punishment. It is basic and logical for the ego to be the protector of the individual's value to himself, and this serviceable part of consciousness will call upon the skills of the person's nature to the nth degree to deny hotly any personal fault or lack. It should be considered a natural reaction, but one cannot depend upon the apt-to-be officious ego alone to solve the problem. This calls for the help of an adult who is supposed to know something about life and human reaction. If the adult standing by does not give attention to the need, the victim of this severe challenge is out of luck and may catch an infection from a pretty dangerous bit of conditioning, namely, personal rejection. Personal rejection is absolute anathema to the self-expansion urge. Too much of it is the death rattle of any individual's chance for dynamic success as a person, unless he starts to work to monitor the kind of imagery which he is providing his mind for his will to obey. And for this, he is going to need help from intelligent adults. The episode pictured above is, of course, the new baby problem, the oft-used example of an everyday but very upsetting fright for a young child. Unless it has been understood by the parents as a blighting shock to the child's self-awareness, and some obligation to meet its devastating effect is assumed by them, the consequences are not apt to be favorable. Above all things, it is no time for punishment. The ill-advised, or just plain lazy, seem to take it for granted that instant punishment will cure anything. Far from it. Punishment will indelibly print rebellion and resistance in a mind lacerated by unhappy experience. This is where the ego makes its common mistake. It pushes the individual willy-nilly toward the dangerous areas of retaliatory emotion, and the battle is on. If the nature has any worthwhile energy in it, the ego will be apt to vow to get that usurper, but good. Don't laugh. The ego has its own way of vowing, even at the age of 3. Yet that self-same rioting ego can become as mild as milk, and forget all about its dire plot if a comforting word, a little loving assurance, and a simple explanation are offered. A willingness to provide soothing balm to the small sufferer is worth its weight in gold, for in most cases it can obliterate that first weighty exposure to rejection, which, among the classic causes of neurosis, has a high score indeed. If we respectfully accept the fact that our nature, physical, emotional, and mental, is miraculous, we must also accept the idea that we cannot very well fool around with a miracle. If we want to benefit from it, it is advisable to learn something about how it is best invited, served, and developed, because this insistent and persistent ego is riddled with the influence upon us by the negative habits and attitudes caused by our very sensitive, emotional susceptibility. Self-pity, false suspicions of enmity from others, mental lethargy, and apathy of purpose can result from rejection and slow down the free use of our original creative energies. For there are no two ways about it. It is mostly the pain suffered in our early, unexplained agonies that makes us fail to get good results with our adult challenges. Thus, we can lose in a minute the values of training and worthwhile advice because memory's tenacity blocks our natural inclination to listen to conscience, the judgment of our souls, and the decisions it recommends. This mass of error in our mind caused by sheer ignorance of how to handle our own natures adjusts itself little by little as we live and learn. Intelligence develops and gives the ego common-sense suggestions, which gradually clarify many of the childish misunderstandings. But not all. The shocks in early life have great power. In judging our ways of living life as to what they mean and whether they are reasonable or unreasonable, it will be helpful to recall that this plaguing process of the past reappearing in the present is always lurking around to trip us into an unnecessarily over-emotional reaction. But forewarned is forearmed, and with a little well-aimed attention we can evade the wretched discomfort of this common experience. It just makes sense to unload long-past bitterness, huff, ill will, and thoughts of revenge, and take up the job of dealing with present emotional problems in a spirit free of the weight of past resentment. If we have given our attention to the discomfort brought on by a disturbing incident from the past attacking our mind, we can invent a means of warding it off. It can be induced to slink away if we make it an unwelcome visitor every time it appears. Say something like this: "Oh, that's the old past in the present. That disturbing incident is long gone. I'm not going to keep living it over and over again. I see what a dumb thing it is to do." Believe it or not, this habit of self-explanation and self-suggestion could turn the old world around from its sadly destructive habit of allowing unpleasant or perhaps unflattering experience to return and return for one more bout of obstructive emotional reaction. Better even to feel a little foolish, if we are so foolish as to have to, when our need is so great to learn not to hand ourselves over to a habit as enslaving as this miserable past in the present invasion. The struggle between a person's natural, free way of reacting to life is constantly being deformed in a child by the ignorant inducement of his powerful emotions, which react instantaneously until trained. The perfectly natural spasms of fear and rage when a person's safety is threatened is automatic. It is folly to blame a child for responding consistently. His emotions demand that he do so. The type of reactions that will follow will take the form of the design of his own nature, more or less placid, fiery, or just curious. But without question he will react, and 10 to 1 his rage, fear, lust, or curiosity will too many times be bent in abnormal directions which can give him trouble in handling life later on. The adjustment of these twisted emotions is never complete until the individual rediscovers the natural reaction patterns of his own nature and relates himself to them rather than to the ignorances of his conditioned ego. For unfortunately, these ignorance can confuse his concept of his own particular nature and lead him away from, rather than toward, an acceptant relation to life. The reason we tend to harp on this matter is because unsuitable conditioning, which drives the ego to dangerous methods in its pursuit of normal self-expansion, prevents us from discovering what we are really like when not conditioned negatively. For whenever rigid negative habits are not replaced by positive ones, a nature can be distorted permanently. Then there is little or no self-knowledge and very little enjoyment from self-expansion. The ego cannot help being influenced by the negative conditioning of the person it serves. It may take seriously the hates the person has developed because of thoughtless or cruel treatment and seek to help him to attain what seems a just revenge. But the so-called hate is the result of the cruel treatment. Such factors of confusion can arise to influence human lives because we have neglected to give much revealing attention to what emotion is and what it does to us day by day and week by week. We are not as yet very sharp about understanding life and turning the understanding into workable realizations. This pertains, of course, to the noumenal world of thought and feeling, not the phenomenal world of objects and action. In the latter, we are becoming more and more adept every decade. These elements of thought and feeling in our personalities have been so constantly at the beck and call of others and so influenced by their attitudes that we have become confused as to how we feel about anything. These larger and stronger figures constantly moving around us in our youth have chosen our actions for us and compelled us to accept them or be punished or nagged into accepting them. Some of the compelling, of course, is necessary to our well-being and in fact our very lives. But at the time we are receiving it, we are not aware of this, nor are we aware that one of the most important functions of our miraculous failures is, or will be, our power of choice. And this very handy ability to choose needs to be encouraged, to be explained, and to be directed toward the discovery of our own natural reactions. In other words, it is the beginning of starting to learn life. The relation of the ego to this extraordinary human power of choosing, however, is often more compromising than helpful. It is not too hard to see that if a living organism is gifted with a power such as free choice that guards his very existence, along with supplying his desires, the expertise with which he handles it must be of special value. If choices are not wisely made, they can bring down disaster or at least every kind of discomfort on his head. Sad to say, the ego is more of a cause for the consequences of poor choice than the more deeply dynamic processes of human nature. Our unwise habit of using the word ego to mean the complete personality has a way of clouding our idea of who and what we are. Indeed, it compounds confusion by seeming to elevate the worldly actions of the ego above the sounder and profounder intuitions of the superconscious, that is, the soul. And it does not help the dilemma much that we appear to be afraid to acknowledge that mystical marvel we once called the soul. The eagerness with which we human beings fall upon any radical discoveries about ourselves is both natural and a little naive. For this avid interest in everything concerning ourselves tends to bring upon us the misfortune, at least temporarily, of the bits and pieces of misunderstanding that generally mix up our minds when a new concept of the nature of man is advanced. Certainly, the present concept of the ego, which quite naturally became associated with the Freudian picture of human psychology, burst upon the world with a rather upsetting force. When Dr. Freud spread the idea that sex was the central drive of human nature, a kind of whirlwind was launched upon life, and its consequences, in relation to recognizing the full scope and reaction breadth of a human being, were exposed to a somewhat inadequate understanding of where to place the ego in the complex design of one's own life. In spite of the intense preoccupation it appears to force on the human race, I must confess that I cannot accept the concept that sex is the central drive of the race consistent with the overall behavior of mankind. Anything that has a tendency to wane with the onset of age does not demonstrate very convincingly the central urge of a vital organism. The desire to be someone does not vanish, even though it tends to wane in later life because of our lack of knowledge of our own natures and how their expansion can best be sustained. To me, what I call self-expansion is obviously the center of mankind's desire. No human being is without some inner urge to excel, and this self-desire is the glory of the human race. Attained or relinquished, it surely is the attribute that can make people worth their salt. And they know it, instinctively, not too specifically, I grant, but nevertheless deeply. In the profound need for each of us to be able to adjust to everyone we meet in life, the ego can offer useful assistance. But it cannot fail to drag into the problem a good many overly self-interested methods to protect our own self-expansion, which naturally has central place in everyone's deepest desires. But all of us have a fund of desires and distastes, wills and won'ts, talents and tepidness, enough to supply our power of choice so that we can accommodate to the desires and needs of others. The thing we need to watch is any unwillingness to allow the other individual his fair share of choices. There is a simple phrase, just 2 words, I want, which indicates the animating force of every human being and causes startling about-face reactions. This I want at the center of our natures quite believably could be seen as like a battery or generator, animating our basic emotions and determined to fulfill our desires. The whole nature of man is really based on satisfying the I want. It creates a focus of attention, as it were, in each person to hold him together as a personality. Certainly to want is thoroughly typical of any human being. Without it, his amazing gamut of powers and possibilities would have no aim or purpose, no sense of direction or force. The I want busily seeks its desires, but seldom gives up wanting more. It reaches out, sometimes gluttonously, for the satisfaction of its wants. Its hunger to supply them is intense, and it is that which makes a human being an urgent, demanding, superactive creature. Is it possible to imagine a living being with no wants? Even a weed in its dim way wants earth and water. Without them it dries up and speedily dies. We too begin to die if our main wants are not supplied to a reasonable degree. We are naturally desiring creatures. Wanting contributes the motive forces of our beings. We must accept this truth and then go to work to sort out our own personal relation to this insistent demand and learn to relate ourselves to it in a contributive as well as self-satisfying way. If the I want, which is the main motivator of the subconscious mind, can become self-educated to understand what thoughts and actions will best foster and sustain our lives, we shall take great strides in adding enjoyment and safety to living. We have indeed been striving for this accommodation since time was, but now that we are such a large group, we need to refine our knowledge and reset our minds and attitudes to accommodate to its growing demands. We have to redraw a picture of the future and fill it in with the fresh colors of a deeper understanding of what we are up against. We must have less faith in just throwing abuse around or hoping to escape being drawn into any blame by pointing the finger at someone else. One of the real obstacles interfering with the attaining of our most important wants is that we allow a greedy overlapping of goals and wishes to immobilize the will. It cannot make out what we really want, so it retires into a comfortable corner and takes a nap, which leaves us flapping about with no will for anything. Result? Disappointment of our wishes. Fooling aside, we are dealing with a cosmic condition, and if we keep on flouting our own wishes in the way we neglect the musts of universal law, we shall land just nowhere in whatever it is we are concerned with. Technological scientists do not do that. They know better and act more wisely. They pay attention and obey. They serve the image with patient repetition. The ego, as liaison agent between an individual and the world, can be helpful in bringing into a person's memory the fad that he must decide whether the satisfaction of an anti-human act is worth what he will have to endure in imprisonment or loss of social standing. This would be all to the good if it were free of its success at any price compulsion, which rules out the influence of moral values. It does not have the mighty power of dedication that comes from a combination of mental insight and high-level emotion. The ego chooses self-protection and tends to stand aside when a situation calls for action against its anti-humanist emotional impulses. There are some very deep challenges in the condition of being human, but there is not much safety in evading meaningful truths forever, especially the ones that deal with evil. To help the cause of the elimination of unquestionable evil, we should try to recall that we are never more miserable than when we have nothing to do. A large part of our great creative abilities is spent on inventing games, conveniences, ornaments, and much more. I have sometimes wondered what percentage of our miraculous talent for inventing has been wasted on trivial inventions that are clearly designed to fill stray, idle moments. Too many for life's advance, I fear. As soon as a baby gets out of the crib, if its own inventiveness lags for want of practice, a penetrating cry fills the house. "Mama, what shall I do?" Aside from eating and sleeping, doing is his whole preoccupation. Why should we not be willing to save a little of the energy we too often waste on really unpromising activity, to welcoming a chance at clearing up unmistakable evil? It offers us something to do. We do not want perfection. It is too close to stalemate. All we want is improvement, not retrogression into savagery. Nevertheless, thank God for innocent invention. We are evolving creatures, not static robots, and to become students and admirers of miraculous continuous inquiry. From why we should brush our teeth to how to stop war, should offer endless opportunities to be at our proven passion for doing, either by thought or action. A great many of us do not fully realize how much of our lives are lived quite separately from the so-called five senses. They take place in the noumenal world, that overwhelmingly omnipresent mental area. It is a realm that we cannot see or physically touch, but how potently we sense it. It is the dwelling place of our emotions which we feel so powerfully, and which so utterly control our joys and sorrows. As we pinch ourselves, we are aware of the fact that it hurts. When we are rejected by someone, we unquestionably suffer. But that kind of suffering does not declare itself in an instantly available manner as does physical pain, the pain which occurs in the noumenal area of experience, not the physical one. However, it can cause a result, and nearly always does, in the physical world, for it sets up tension from whatever basic emotion it has stirred up, and tension is a phenomenal result which can be perceived by the senses. Thus, it can, and often does, end in physical symptoms. There is no doubt about our feeling it, often painfully. I can still recall, if I try, that awful gone feeling in the region of my stomach, when as a child I was blamed or accused for something I had not done, or had lost the affection of a friend for no reason that I could understand. The emotional collapse that accompanies serious rejection can even border on despair, and despair can produce illness. But since the rejection is not in itself physically formed, it cannot, to our physical sense-ridden attention, be specifically recognized. We just have to suffer it out, feeling alone, abandoned, uninformed, and according to one's age and situation, pretty desperate. There is a greater need than we realize for us to see more clearly the actuality of our invisible individualities, and this is more possible than we realize if we will add to our thought the simple truth that when our feelings are pinched, we suffer. And that is no joke, considering that if we do not understand what is actually happening and have not at hand a few home truths about how the emotional damage should be handled, we can carry scars, invisible ones of course, that can threaten the well-being of our physical bodies. Another significant example, but in an opposite area of human reaction, can help to fill out the great panorama of our invisible emotional lives. Suppose we have had an especially exciting adventure, or even a piece of the best apple pie ever tasted in all our lives. Or perhaps we have become acquainted with a member of the opposite sex who appreciates us mightily. Afterward, what happens? We would give anything to repeat the experience. But can we do so? Yes, if the response of our miracle minds offers us certain agencies to assist us, so that we shall not be disappointed. From within us, without our even having to lift a hand, appear memory and imagination. These two represent to us the experiences we so enjoyed. Such representations may not be as vivid as the events themselves. But along comes hope and, without asking any laborious action from us, it stimulates belief into assurance that it is quite possible to repeat our pleasurable memories in reality, if not the exact same ones, others as interesting and enjoyable. Chances are we will not even take the trouble to be grateful for the truly miraculous powers of our own natures, which freely offer us this repetition of enjoyment in memory and the sensation of hope which is a potential promise of more to come. For we misuse our emotions in an endless number of cases by pushing wonder, which is dependent upon imagination for most of its contributions to our pleasure, toward greed rather than toward gratitude. In the same way, we debauch our realm of feeling until we experience severe discomforts by overloading the miraculous physical processes of our bodies, which are planned to handle adequate food supplies, not surfeit. We actually throw away many an opportunity for contentment, and often even joy, by carelessly allowing greed to demand more. Thus attention, the primary gateway to experience, is thrust by this demand for surfeit into the habit of sullen ingratitude from unwelcome physical symptoms. In the everyday world of earning a living, we have made some effort to put this concept of well-handled emotion into common use. We do not all expect to go to the ball game when we should be at work, despite the frequency with which grandmothers are buried on the days the major baseball leagues are playing. We do not expect to receive the accolade of wildly enthusiastic applause as a pianist if we have not given our attention to getting command of the keyboard. We do not expect to become the mechanic everyone asks for to put his car in condition unless we have tried to perfect ourselves in mechanical expertise and succeeded. We need to do a better job in the yeasty world of emotion, disabusing it of too much acquiescence to the ego and working persistently to persuade the ego and emotion to shake hands and begin to live together like friends. The results might be both startling and entrancing. Chapter 4. Pursuit of Life. In a section called Deft Definitions in a magazine, I noticed the word egotist defined and was interested in the genuine deftness of the definition as follows. Egotist. A guy who's always me-deep in conversation. There is no getting away from it. Each of us is, has been, or will be some time or other that kind of me. But there should be no sense of disgrace attached to that fact, only a recognition that if we refuse to become interested in ourselves, why should anyone else be interested? Nature insists upon self-appreciation. It is the engine of personal success. It keeps us going and trying to earn the prize of recognizable personal value of some sort. The nature of intelligence, however, puts in its oar and says, no point in losing your popularity by overdoing a good thing. Let the next guy get his share of the me-deep satisfaction. And thus, life's great job of rounding out the needs of humanity is served, and we learn to take our fair share, and no more, of the champagne of praise. The ego, even while still only on an instinctive level, is a bona fide aid in the process of living. The secret of its error, when it mars the life of its owner, lies in its youthfulness, its inexperience in knowledge of the processes that will produce a satisfying life rather than a precarious one. Each of us is born to this challenge. The best inheritance a child can have is gentle, persistent, sensible instruction from an early age. If we are required to face the life of being a near miracle, we need experience and learning more urgently than any other living creature. Every child is born with a widely ranging I want, and the ego almost immediately starts in pursuit of the enticing objects, sensations, and experiences life offers. And here is where its youthfulness trips it up and lands it in difficulties. It does not watch out, it becomes just a wanting machine. This will not lead to a particularly enjoyable life, for there are too many penalties involved. Without experience, the young ego suffers a good deal in getting it. That is why respect for learning is such a protection in anyone's life. Willingness to learn is beyond price and the only thing that will move life forward. If the ego is going to succeed in bringing its owner the benefits of a well-rounded life, it will have to aim some of its attention and effort on knowing as well as on wanting. A balance between wanting and knowing what to want can make a good life, but just concentrated wanting can lead to overdoing and land one in surfeit, a state of too muchness which ultimately tends to end in illness. It also frustrates the whole purpose of wanting, which obviously means enjoying. Anyone who wants to end in illness or in jail has taken leave of his intelligence or has none. In the pursuit of self-expansion, if the ego is gluttonous in its choices and quantities and confuses pampering its appetites with attaining success, it reverses the whole process of self-expansion and ends up as a loser. Because too much is against nature, which has its own automatic inward sense of balance and does not hesitate to punish the offender against its balanced requirements by giving him trouble to deal with. As he winds up with several too many drinks, he tends to say to himself, "Now, why did I do that?" He finds himself unable to give an answer that actually answers. Oh, he will want to drink again, of course. But once the subject has been opened in his mind, it may tease him into getting a little more balance into his relation to alcohol. The odd little word ID was used by Freud and other well-known delvers into the noumenal world of thought and feeling to indicate a useful element of our instinctual response area. Freud said, the ego tries to mediate between the world and the ID to make the ID comply with the world's demands. The behavior of the egotist is very similar to that of the ID, although it differs in having a focus on social response and recognition. The egotist knows and cares what other people think and have to say about how he behaves, but in the end, it is he himself he values. He loves no one else. He has forsaken true self-expansion and concentrated on self-absorption. While we see more and more evidence for the claim that a human being comes very close to being a miracle, we must face the undeniable fact that we are young miracles, existing in an evolutionary condition. All young living organisms must learn how to live, how to use and develop what they find themselves endowed with. Primitive human beings were crude and clumsy, their minds slow and backward. But are they still? Far from it. The bodies and minds of man have changed, have become more refined and competent. This process of refinement is an automatic factor of the life process. Human ingenuity opens up the road ahead, offering promises that only a miracle would be capable of. But perhaps the greatest gift in the whole sheaf of our endowments is the power to choose. In the whole evolutionary movement, this power is decisive. If we neglect or abuse it, disastrous losses to us and to life are the result. A justification for admitting that our egos are not always our friends lies in the fact that the ego makes many errors in its use of the power of choice. It can literally decide whether a life is a success or a failure. The ego's say-so can certainly be of use to us if we fully understand its place in our lives and what it offers in the way of help with our problem of living. The joke on us all, though, is that our egos aim a constant barrage of trouble at us unless we recognize that this, as we might call it, social business secretary, is only a secretary and not a boss. Useful as the ego can be, we cannot let it rule our lives completely. It is not wise enough to make our more important choices. The most common of the dangers to the individual which the ego presents come from the fact that it is required to deal momently with a certain fundamental habit of mind. This can hardly be avoided because one of our natural habits is based on a continuous function of the mind, the memory. Bits and pieces of past experience, along with the whole drama of what a person has lived through, are always flowing in and out of memory. Their effect upon one's immediate mood can change that mood from moment to moment according to the nature of these remembered experiences. They can only too easily stir up the untrained, callous elements of the basic emotions. Fury, terror, lust, or primitive inquisitiveness can be drawn up by recollection from the depths of memory and twist a person's attitudes in his present existence. The resentments formed during childhood are in most cases valid in the sense that they are impressions of punishment for that which the child does not understand as error. In actual fact, it cannot fairly be called valid error for a child to break his mother's expensive bottle of perfume when he is so new to life that he is not even aware of his mother's feeling about it, or consciously acquainted with the meaning of the word feeling. But the chastisement he receives implies a crime. And since he does not clearly know what the word crime means, he is merely aware of a sensation of fear and deprivation of love, security, in the loss of the favor of his mother and father, sustainers of his existence. Underneath it all, his memory is becoming cluttered with so many images that he is doing wrong, that there is little room for him to discover that the blame he receives is way out of proportion to the evil he has committed. The infant's job in life is to experiment with experience until he can learn how to separate experience into the good and bad as it affects him. He has to find out which is comforting and which is painful, what will be successful and what will fail, who is for him and who against. He is not being selfish in his absorption in his own interests. Life itself demands that he develop an intelligent relation to experience and can do little for him if he refuses it. It gives him a powerful instinct, too, to see that he does it. The instinct of self-preservation. But in this primary need of his being, he starts out supremely dependent upon his family situation. If his parents are not themselves able or willing to give him the intelligent and patient help he so desperately needs, his emotions are going to become strained beyond his capacity to handle them wisely, with possibly far-reaching results. An actual horde of emotional reactions from memory can be, and is, constantly dragged back to a person's attention. These reactions can fit quietly and comfortably into a present situation, or throw a bomb into it that can change it from mild to contentious to even fatal. Thus, unless one has come to terms with old, disturbing experiences in his life and can handle any negative reaction, they may have left festering in the subconscious area of memory. He can be pushed into an emotional spasm of some kind that can run from foolishness to disaster. Of course, this memory recall can serve us in an absolutely essential way by bringing back instantaneously the exact memories we need to carry on our lives, from remembering what the date is to recalling a complex process to complete a complex job. It seems that the very essence of education lies in removing the misconceptions coming out of this dilemma of the resentment or fear-loaded memory. Everything we try to learn later can be hampered in some way unless the resentments in memory are healed. We should approach the training of the young with constructive humility, as a privilege, and estimate the value of our lives according to how sincerely we have gained the adult attitude. The surest guarantee against really evil actions is to watch our motives. If we can keep them clear of evil intent toward others and life, we can rest our conscience, for we will not fall into evil ways. There is a pronounced spiritual impulse embedded in the human mind and heart. Generosity is possible. Tenderness exists. The saving of life is revered. These benign impulses can gradually remove the stored resentments that are of no earthly use to individuals in living a worthwhile life. If we can remove the ignorance about what a price we pay for hanging on to the old, tired, but still nagging memories, we shall be able to get a new start for dealing intelligently with the natural, normal resentments and disappointments every adult must face. If we will try to understand this actual fact of the struggle with unresolved angers in the human subconscious and take it as an obligation to life and those we love to cast them out of the memory depths, we can work a miracle. Black, white, red, or yellow, short, tall, fat, or lean, no one is without some degree of a deep yearning to be appreciated and praised. It is the hub of life experience around which the wheel of every human being's nature revolves. It is not a disgrace. It is the vibrant, purposeful force of our existence. All it needs is understanding of its purpose and gratitude for it, as an antidote for the persistent threat of inertia typical of self-absorption, which is the complete opposite of self-expansion. The latter's aim is self-development, but self-absorption works, and works hard, on self-indulgence. Faithful servant as the ego is to this tremendous dynamo of longing in the heart of humanity, it can become sucked into negative mood by the continuing reappearance in memory of painful experiences from the past. The same emotional response that caused the original distress, such as anger, frustration, fear of consequences, shame, bitter disappointment, and so on, can repeat itself in the person's present experience and take the place of the more normal mood he may have been in. And the sad part of it is that a mere word or phrase, a harsh or sneering tone of voice, is all it takes to throw the unready victim into his old neurotic mood and attitude toward life and disturb his relation to present experience. Having for its familiar tools of accomplishment only the experiences the individual has known, the ego is greatly balked by this reappearance of past terrors, disappointments, lost loves, false accusations, painful envies, to name just a few of the ills that mind is heir to. They can be pushed up into a person's consciousness and attack his confidence in his own abilities with the impact of a sledgehammer. He is suddenly confused and uncertain because the images memory slips into his mind bring emotions along with them that can force him out of balance. If nothing worse, they will scatter his attention, and on the command of his attention, he is fully dependent for an effective use of his intelligence. We try to train ourselves to conceal this painful confusion, but emotions are not easy to hide, and therefore training emotions ahead of time is very much more successful than trying to calm them down when they are boiling. Fortunately for the human race, and thanks to the stretch of its miraculous powers, we have recognized this dilemma and set up enough civilized customs to smooth out somewhat the effect upon us of such emotional attacks. But these mechanisms, with good manners as an irresistible force to lead the way, are not yet deft enough to prevent the strain of the floods of self-doubt that can come from past experience. Being aware that we have failed many times, and having been blamed every time, our self-confidence is far from shatterproof. We still do not fully realize how profoundly we need to admit the seriousness of an attack on self-confidence, which this uprush of memory can cause in our ability to stabilize our lives. But much can be done by watching and recognizing this drama happening in one's own experience. This exasperating mental-emotional habit can be evaded. We can refuse to allow past experience to govern the moods of the present. We can train the ego to relax and say to this haunt, that appears suddenly and tries to take over. Get thee hence, most dismal and unwelcome problem from the past. My memory is one of my most indispensable tools. I do not intend to allow it to cripple me emotionally by dragging up the memories of past problems. But the starting point in clearing the mind of unpleasant memories from the past which cast their shadow on the present is to recognize that this type of unexpected mental drama, disturbing our confident handling of present situations, is a common experience for just about every one of us. We all are subject to nervous doubt about ourselves to some degree, although the force it shows is certainly influenced by the kind and degree of neurosis that may have infected the person involved. Also, it is apt to be so merged with a compound sensation of risks to our egos, the fear that we may not be accepted with full admiration, that we can hardly sort out how risky we believe the risks are. There is a natural basic conflict in all of us, the solving of which is an ever-present strain on our making of decisions. Shall we follow faithfully the traditions and practices of the world and overlook the feeling for truths that originate spontaneously in our own minds and hearts? There can be little doubt which choice has been the most popular between mundane traditions and deep awareness of truths. Although a good deal has been said and written about what the inner life of man is like, it is not easy for us to be securely aware of what our own emotions mean to us as it is to understand what objects are for and how to deal with them. We cannot see emotion. We can only observe how we and others react to it. When we are very angry, we know that something invisible has us in its power and attracts our attention strongly, sometimes even frantically. When terror hits us, we cannot deny that it controls us, at least temporarily. It may even cause us to feel faint. When love touches us with its comforting promises, we welcome it gladly, even desperately sometimes. When keen interest, with its endless curiosity, enters our consciousness, we are aware that it is not just a myth. It is an unquestionable reality. It has the power to move our mind and stir our body. It can draw us to the ends of the earth, no matter what discomforts may be involved. It can have that much pull on our desire, our commanding, insistent I want, the force that rules our life and works in complete alliance with our yearning to succeed. We pay little or no real attention to anything that does not appeal to us, tickle us, excite us, or stimulate our personal I want. Is it any wonder that if a person is not allowed to pursue some factor of this great hunger, his life can hang heavy on his hands and all too often end in some sort of stalemate? Although we cannot visually recognize these strong forces that pull and push us around every day of our lives, we are most certainly aware of them. They are close to being the total content of our attention. Objects naturally loom large in our lives, but it is probably fair to say that how we feel about them looms even larger. We are creatures who, a little too irresistibly, feel first and think afterward. To the degree that we can bring these two types of response into better balance, we shall have at least one important answer to reducing the woes which aggravatingly lie in wait for us. Unless a person is hopelessly cocky, it is not too difficult to acknowledge to himself that rage has suddenly taken hold of him and that he wants to hurt whoever caused it. If it happens to us, and is someone centrally important in our lives, we should give ourselves a chance to refrain from fury, and instead try energetic courage and emotional generosity. The combination is magical. Great and hopeful experiences can grow from such a choice. It takes no longer than the wink of an eye. The speed of thought is closer to the speed of light than to a snail's afternoon walk, unless, of course, we must feed our spite. And here is a cue to the problem the ego mainly presents. It tends to overrate its own ability and tries to force its own worldly concepts of what life is and how it should be handled in every situation that arises. Correcting the bad habit of always allowing spite to have its way can only come through growth. Growth includes the recognition that even our close to miraculous selves are born with incomplete personalities and must patiently and willingly learn. In order to enjoy more and more of the benefits of life, which offer us a superabundance of pleasurable and interesting reactions to choose from, surely we should be willing to pay something. One thing is certain, they are definitely not for free. They are earned. The ego can be a master in the many and various processes of living, from body health, home care, and business success to recreation and entertainment. It can help us to discover how to be comfortable in everyday life, personal, social, business, domestic, and so on. But the ego's preoccupation with success in personal self-expansion does limit its adequate use of attention to admit and learn to handle the prodigious power emotion wields. It can become clumsy in its handling of troublesome emotion, and thus lose ground in its dogged pursuit of the objective development of its owner. The ego must be brought to regard the profound power and instant reaction urge of emotion with more understanding. It needs the help of the original creative force which conceived and produced the force of emotion and endowed the human race with its evolutionary power. But it would be wasted motion to try to use our ego as an agency to contact original creative force. It is nowhere near adult enough for such a profound attempt. We should seek, rather, the agency of our spiritual nature to promote that sort of plea. The ego would definitely botch it. In its weird temerity, it even tries to set the Creator straight. The ego has a tendency to be willful, and too often overly willful, in its relation to the desire for total success. That deeply personal wish is irresistible. It is the ego's baby, one might say, and it passionately desires to bring it to full, impressive maturity. Do not mothers and fathers crave to do the same with their offspring? But the hit-or-miss training of young egos by parents can cause delay and even catastrophe in human life. Our lack of knowledge of the strength of the inner life of man and its effect upon his handling of his outer action is a barrier indeed. How many have included in their outlook upon life any consideration of the presence within their natures of a tremendous hunger to be somebody and an equivalent intent to accomplish it? But in the relative confusion about how we can experience this insistently hoped-for goal, we find it difficult to visualize the goal. We have perhaps never even named it, and so it never became very real to us. We have just been aware of an overwhelming desire to count for something and to win praise. Basically, then, the human ego is a combination of thought and feeling transferring itself into action, primarily in the service of our main goal in life, self-expansion, the passion to manifest some type of value or importance in life. It will do no good to try to shudder away from this goal in mock modesty, for it is natural and useful to life. It can do much to overcome the contrary passion of indolence, for which there is a strong temptation if the demands of life put too many obstacles in the way of success in the pursuit of personal excellence. It is certainly natural to desire such success, and it carries a kind of promise that life will continue on its evolutionary path to greater and greater things. Most important of all, time can easily be wasted and energy wrongly used if we fail to keep life in balance. We overload ourselves from the objective world and neglect to relate ourselves adequately enough to the inner world of meaning. Mankind's possibilities are awe-inspiring, but can only be safely produced with the help of self-knowledge that could reduce man's painful mistakes in ratio to his command of the greatest of all types of personal insurance, the ability and desire to know himself. Chapter 5. Balanced Living. The Chinese have expertise with brush and color. They seem to have a special affinity for color that makes them capable of the most delicate effects. But in the following Chinese proverb, I met for the first time their unusual handling of humor. Exaggeration is to paint a snake and add legs. This witty definition appealed to me as the most comical and convincing definition of exaggeration I had ever discovered, for no one who has not taken leave of his intelligence can insist that a snake with legs is not a gross exaggeration. There is something more than usually convincing in the gaiety of this example which accents the very essence of the too much. However, it also shows how closely exaggeration can lapse into absurdity or carry us into the realm of untruth. If we have been rejected in vital ways in youth, we later are apt to exaggerate in our own minds. Many a remark or action of other people, so that without our realizing it, we push the remark or action into an exaggeration. It is a pitiful but common experience for a person deeply scarred by repeated rejections to trump up the wildest notions of how he or she is hated, slighted, wronged, when what is really being experienced may merely be evidence of another person's neurotic recall of rejections in his own childhood. It may be the result, and only the result, of a sudden spasm of recollection from early conditioning that has thrown this person into a bitter mood, which he then, not realizing he is doing it, or does he, passes on to someone else. It can happen somewhere every day, every hour. Genial self-instruction can correct many threatening situations, so form the habit in such situations of putting yourself through a quick mental review, saying to yourself, I wonder if something I said hit one of those push buttons that always starts up a person's negative memory recall. But there's no sense in my getting wild-eyed over one of his early experiences. Then say to him, hey man, did I say something that rubbed you the wrong way? Never meant to, believe me. It can prevent a good many totally unnecessary clashes with family or acquaintances or important business associates. A display of generosity of that sort is almost bound to shock the other person out of the train of thought that caused his anger, and it will be harder to reinstate it because of the interruption of the train of thought. Negative emotions feed themselves on their own force. If that force can be stopped, even for a minute, it will be much harder to continue the mood. Unless, of course, you were in a mood yourself to want to bait another person. If so, stiffen up your mental muscles, for it will be a longer, tougher session than expected. Action and reaction are equal in the emotional world just as fatally as in the objective one. In fact, the emotional world is apt to be more dangerous than the world of objects, for objects have no feeling and no capacity to react dangerously. If you find you have a flat tire at a most inconvenient time, it may annoy you so that you kick the tire. What can it do but accept the blow meekly? But what have you gained? A lame foot maybe, but also a valuable opportunity to command your own emotions. Anyway, try the above method at the first opportunity. It can work, so keep on trying it until it becomes automatic. Never forget that the non-ego portion of your nature holds the finest and most productive elements. Do not neglect it. Be proud of it and protect it from too much of a drag from the monkey shines of the ego. A capacity to know and understand is within you ready to help with your developing self-acquaintance. It will be wise also never to forget this fact about your not being just your ego, for it will protect your process of self-discovery as you begin to search for and meet up with the finer elements of your nature that you may not have fully recognized before. These can then begin to start acting more spontaneously as you free them from any misjudgments and the consequences of a neurotic ego. This is a process of growth, of course, not a lightning flash of complete freedom from the burdens of neurotic response. But you will come upon bits and pieces of greater awareness of what you like or dislike, what you believe in, what you desire. You will begin to recognize your own relation to life, your own choices that can stabilize your life, and will show you how living could be with less and less neurosis. When your mind becomes quiet, it becomes clear. That is the state it needs to see how to discard neurotic reactions from the repeated return of neurotic thoughts. This is how it can discard the infantile habit of self-defense the ego uses so often. You will find even at the early stage of your efforts that you will be getting a lift from tracking down neurotic reactions and deactivating them. You will become more and more adept at noticing your neurotic thoughts and actions and be tossing them out without regret. There will be a growing sense of relief at the idea that you can examine the old guilts, face them, and re-see their meaning. You will then make up your mind as to whether they carry real guilt or the false guilt of neurotic tendency. You may have a reaction that quite clearly indicates a habit from the neurotic aspect of the ego, like a burst of rage at some friend's scoffing remark about one of your pet loves or beliefs. Suddenly you feel as though you were about to blow up. Your voice comes out shrill instead of calm. You start talking a mile a minute, accusing the other person of anything that comes handy, from being stupid to hopelessly ignorant. Do you stop for one moment to ask yourself how your friend may be feeling? Far from it. Your ego tells you that your friend has insulted you by disagreeing with you. It urges you to launch your own attack. And what will you gain? Certainly not the persuading of the other to an acceptance of your opinion. Has your ego not let you down by using its persuasion to convince you of some questionable belief? Anyone acquainted with the ego's concern over self-expansion would be very much inclined to believe its vehemence had something to do with its avid pursuit of that great goal. Also, the louder a voice, the greater the likelihood of a faint doubt in the shouter of the validity of his own position. Exaggerations of normal behavior can always be fairly suspected of being an impulse of the ego rather than a true expression of the person doing the exaggerating. An odd thing about the ego's almost frantic determination to serve the attainment of self-expansion in the person it inhabits is that in its greedy willingness to use any method to attain this goal, it risks lessening instead of increasing the attaining of the goal. No one has reached an important place in life if he is lodged in prison, if his reputation is brought low, if he puts all his hope in the acquisition of money and resorts to illegal means to acquire it. It might even be fairly referred to as success by failure, the failure of intelligent choice. The risk of loss through illicit methods of gain throws a searchlight on the results. It reveals what appears to be a great hidden principle that declares it is impossible to comfortably enjoy ill-gotten gains. Large quantities of money often come from ill-gotten gains, but do the recipients remain secure? The real question is, can secure consequences be produced by the use of destructive methods? If so, somewhere along the line logic has been lost and there is no such thing as a dependable principle. And yet, common sense asserts and experience demonstrates that action and reaction are equal. The universe is not a flimsy structure. It merely seems so from certain angles until the human individual, struggling with the pressure of the four basic emotions, submits to the experience and the reward of learning. The ego is adept at spoiling our chances of success in human relations by exaggerating the fear of possible rejection. We ourselves seldom realize how often we seem to reject another person by listening to the barrage of critical comment our ego is so often offering about that other person. We accept its decisions too hastily to protect our own skins, not fully realizing that we mostly use the indefensible method of irrational opposition, which induces the person so treated to dive right down to the lower rungs of his emotional nature and come up seething with rage. We seldom realize how often we interrupt the other person in a discussion with doubtfully valuable comments because the demanding ego must have its say, whether it has any meaning or not. Until we accept the truth that the responses of the ego are largely a defense of ourselves against anticipated rejection of many kinds, we have little knowledge of how much our ways of responding to experience are bent into fending off that suspicion of rejection. The ego's habits are very nearly completely formed by the dread of rejection or deprivation of some sort, and the methods we take to escape them soon settle into habits. But such habits seldom add to our popularity. Improperly used, exaggeration is one of the universal traps of common life, and with these exaggerated negative implications goes a dangerous stimulation of adverse feeling that is secretly unfriendly and can bring retaliation from others. The stretching of truth for gain, influence, or the arousing of fear, which will be of assistance in attaining power over others, is a common factor in life, and it is the ego that primarily uses that device. Since it is the ego's passion to make a good showing in the attainment of self-expansion, this encourages the use of exaggeration to a point where it can easily slip into abuse of others. The subconscious mind being completely suggestible, unless a strong counter-suggestion, indeed a command from the superconscious mind, is applied, we can be influenced by what turns out to be untruths of all shapes and sizes, or at least very potent negative exaggerations. The ego will even invent untruths to assure its chance for power. The human race has a job to do to clear the way before peace, financial stability, and full enjoyment of the experience of living can be trustfully expected. Naturally, a central issue is to work out how the helplessly suggestible human subconscious, on which we must depend for a high % of the energy we badly need to handle experience, can be protected from exposure to weakening kinds of suggestion. And this problem takes us right back to our good fortune in owning a power of choice. For that redeeming power can be placed at the command of the higher mind, as well as being influenced by the ego. So one of its indispensable duties is to choose against the ego when it offers the will images of action that are evil, that is, destructive to activities that will nourish the best in life rather than the worst. The subconscious mind is strongly controlled by the I want, but must keep a continuous contact with the superconscious area of thought or existence, pursues its course on a pretty low, self-indulgent level, and will cut a person off from true progress. Then emotional confusion and misuse cause so much debauching of the I want that no coherent civilization can be formed. Why did the human race, in all its varieties, work out a series of attitudes and give each a name that specifically indicates a way of living one's life to get the best results? Not how to build a house, or plant a garden, or play a game, all of which are equally valuable in living a satisfactory life, but meanings, ways of thinking, choices of purpose and action, that would stimulate and protect the best values of life, increase its satisfactions, add safety, and encourage better methods. This reaching for more wisdom to direct the wants and wills of a growing populace toward constructive attitudes was absolutely necessary to keep people's actions and relationships wholesome and mutually protective. Otherwise, rampant egos, seeking personal pleasure rather than self-expansion, would cause constant paralyzing fear, dangerous rage, unbridled rape, or a sneaking invasion of other people's privacy. No word but pandemonium would describe the result. Do we not, to some degree, experience that very thing from time to time? One very essential remedy for preventing periodic examples of hysteria bubbling up in human conduct would be a careful, rather than a hit-or-miss use of exaggeration. Exaggeration adds to the charm and amusement of life when based on things like humor and communal play. It lands us in chagrin and even disaster when used by the ego as a means of increasing self-expansion by too frequently evading the truth. It also is adept at inventing all sorts of ideas and methods to serve the legitimate deep desire of mankind to reach its greatest possible development. The ego is an essential part of this process. If it invents a few too many hopeful methods, some of which are not only obstructive but close to silly, to help in the great attainments of the race, they can be reviewed and changed. The clever side of the ego will be apt to be the agent to discover the mistake and suggest the remedy. We would be hard-pressed in handling life without the ego, but having ruefully admitted that our emotions are dangerous indeed, if not watched and directed, and must be trained to act sanely, we can hardly leave the ego out in a plea for better balanced education of the complete human psyche. A part of human thought and human language supplies the need for guideposts to indicate what we must aim for. Otherwise, we are not able to attain and enjoy our own desires, hopes, and keener awareness. This dilemma must have kept the thinking contingents of the early peoples pretty busy. But idea after idea began to take form, and names were invented for them. And a demand was put upon the groups and tribes by whoever was effectively able to act with authority to set up explanations for these words and require that they be put into practice. The words and their meanings began gradually to become popular as they proved the possibility of smoothing out some of the rough spots for people who had to work together, collect food together, play together. The most interesting and significant factor about this growth of a language to start a communal means of communication was that no matter how widely spread out on the earth, each group of people, prompted by instinctive need, started the same process. They saw that particular requirements were necessary to make communal life workable, safe, and enjoyable. So the thinking individuals in the different races came up with generally equivalent realizations of what was needed, plus a word to identify it. They were all imagining and naming a vocabulary of attitudes that approximately, if not exactly, duplicated the other ones everywhere on Earth. This happenstance seems to have something miraculous about it, and certainly significant in regard to the relationship of the whole mass of the Earth's population. It is so significant that it should be taken into account in any estimate of the value and productive use of these attitudes. It also gives a hint of the universal relationship of every race to every other race. If we are to gain deeper and more workable methods for living life well and enjoyably, it will be necessary to understand the ego more fully than we do. Obviously, we must accept as a fact of life its inescapable compulsion to serve the great goal of self-expansion. That passionate desire is the help of the race, even though it must be molded into a process of harmless, not destructive, action by all of us. Also, we must face up to the inconvenient fact that the ego cannot be recognized by any of the physical senses. Only its results, its effects, can be observed. Life is full of evidence of the ego at work, and the relationship between this lively thought mill and man's natural goal of self-expansion is obvious. But the fear of failure forces the ego into a time-wasting habit, the glaring mistake of self-justification. There is nothing stranger in all life than the irrationality of psychoneurosis and the habit of self-justification, which is delaying our freeing ourselves from the bondage of psychological mechanisms. Self-justification, which seems to have settled on us as a constant ego habit, is a supreme example of an ego trick to try to cover up its errors. It is the irrationality caused by the stubborn addiction of the ego to fairly constant self-justification that is causing much of the delay in self-understanding. Justification of the self on an irrational basis is far from the real truth. This, of course, delays development of sound self-understanding. But the ego is not just to be blamed for the damage it often causes in the choices it makes of trying to fulfill its aim in producing satisfying personal development. All the forces of the nature are needed to support this important goal, and the ego, with its facility for adjusting people to daily life, is obviously qualified to contribute to the job. But it must agree to accept the help it vitally needs if it is to succeed. It must look for assistance from the power of emotion, the intelligence of which the mind is capable, and the more developed awareness of the meanings and purposes of life, typical of the supermind displayed by the soul. In a word, it must not acquire the fatal attitude of egotism. If it does, it becomes just about useless in the development of humanity. We are all human, and in that humanness is a touchstone that, if we will let it, could brush away tons of the small aggravations out of which we erect the miserable scarecrows of our lives. But sad to say, the ego is a past master at stirring up endless prejudices. It is so scared it may miss out in perfecting its chances for a stupefyingly wonderful expansion of its own personality that it undermines its best chances for success. Like it or not, the part of life we experience the most deeply, that is, joyfully, is always related to either feeling or meaning, and usually both. If we want to be more comfortable in life, we need to understand these two insistent areas of our beings and the kind of help they need from us if we are to gain that added comfort. Can a man help feeling threatened in his meaning as a man if some other man's ego prevents him from getting a business advantage he was counting on? Every one of us is endowed with a power to choose and to correct our choices as to whether or not they work. It is the hope of an ultimately better life for everyone, but a quite natural fear for ourselves stalls many a possibility of improving business, banking, investment methods, and so on, because it seems too risky to think about the well-being of the little man. So we drop him out of our minds, failing to remember that if someone does not work out the problem he is incapable of handling, all of us are stuck with it. If we could come to see how powerful the central I want is in everyone, we might admit to ourselves that it just could straighten out the life on Earth to an amazing degree for us to do something about getting some practical command of our emotions. That is, the desire realm. Certainly, the very problem with the handling of one's emotions is that they too easily burst into overactivity. The child suddenly screams with rage and throws things, or cowers in a corner in a pitifully frozen state of fear. It is none other than exaggeration of emotion that opens the door to endless varieties of discomfort for the human being. So we can justly say that one very disastrous element in neurosis is an unnecessary misuse of exaggeration. Why do we use formulas and ceremonies to hold down to sensible results the magnificent but over-exuberant impulses of our natures? Because while that flow of exuberance is the hope of life's success, it is also the threat of its extinction. It is so great a force that we are obliged to channelize it by chosen phrases to help the individual to choose impulses that will hold his emotional strength in leash. That is why the early tribes, as they developed languages, slowly realized the power of principles and began to give them names and expound their values to the members of their human groups. Without realizing it, they were starting the principle of the power of the image in a person's mind that brings about the way his nature develops. What is the purpose of the Hippocratic Oath, the marriage ceremony, the investiture of officials of state? Their purpose is to rouse the better impulses of man, such as responsibility, honesty, fair play, cooperation, and attach them as far as possible to the more important life requirements. In other words, to induce, if possible, a self-promise in the individual involved to reach for his highest, not his lowest, impulses in handling responsibilities. Balance may seem a slightly stuffy-sounding banner to wave at gloriously exuberant life, but let us visualize the demand made upon us by the teeming life we are thrust into with no knowledge, just instinct, to guide us until we can acquire knowledge. Too bad we are so slow in realizing the possibilities in our long list of miraculous qualifications. A mind with which to choose, emotions with which to feel and to enjoy, a body that responds well to wise treatment, even a mischievous ego with extraordinary ingenuity. When we turn our thought away from something disturbing and begin to try some of the methods and attitudes that serve mental and emotional health, the disturbed feeling begins to shrink from malnutrition. It has nothing to feed on, the process of attention being the main food on which consciousness lives. Of course, mind and emotion need food, for they are a downright masterful part of the living organism, and its invisible parts will not continue to thrive without food, and healthy food at that. Courage, caution, companionability, and interest, the higher octaves of rage, fear, sex, and wonder, exist in every human being and require nourishment to continue to serve the being they inhabit. They may not be physically visible, but their effects, the results of their actions, are very visible and are altogether necessary to the progress of man's life. And the quality of the food they receive is as important as with any solid sustenance a person puts in his mouth. The positive aspects of emotion should be fed with respect and encouragement and sensible attention. Fear should be elevated to its higher octave, caution, not wasted on false alarms. Rage, which is a source of energy, should be transmuted to the support of human accomplishment. Love, the potentially gentle emotion, is direly needed to deal with loneliness. Wonder, the great interpreter, if adequately used, could banish ignorance from life. The broad gamut of possibilities the Creator has offered us includes the freedom to choose the necessary solutions to our problems, and it may not be easy, but a sense of triumph from accomplishment that was a cinch is not very apt to be enjoyed by anyone. In simple appreciation of gifts from the great designer, it does not seem too taxing a job to respond with building active images in our minds that will ultimately bring about results which manifest wisely, sanely, effectively, and kindly in life. Chapter 6. Your Inner Self. In the problem of the dangers the neurotic ego introduces into life, there is one central thing we can do which could little by little remove the friction and strife caused by warring egos. If we can convince ourselves that we will quite naturally benefit, as much as our associates will, by recognizing that a generous use of constructive humility could make life over for everyone, we can free existence from an age-long servitude, the bondage of millions of egos, each determined to rule, not themselves but everybody else. However, we must have a clear idea of what we mean by the qualifying word constructive in connection with the word humility. For if we fail to get the meaning intended, in regard to the education of the ego, we could bog down into a mealy-mouthed, apologetic, creepy kind of habit and attitude that could be too offensive for anyone to endure. Because of the problems produced by the questionable methods the ego often uses in its pursuit of self-expansion, a few broad hints are certainly in order in regard to establishing a check-rein, such as constructive humility, on the untrained ardor of the ego. Armed with a bit of such constraint, the ego might make fewer errors in its often poorly aimed persistence in search of personal excellence. The greatest danger to be faced is having to choose between noumenal values and money. Each can and should be valued in relation to its meaning and effect on life. But all the money in the world will not pay for losing the instructions of wisdom or the reassurances of love. When the ego's choice runs over into areas of illicit competition such as sly dissembling, out-and-out deception, misrepresentation in order to steal advantage, life is faced with a pileup of troubles. Temporary business gains may be made, but the slyness of the methods used tend to create bad feeling, and bad feeling interferes with business processes. They become unstable, and the economy of the country can become so disordered as to create undue and unfair suffering. In other words, general confusion results from any instability entering into once soundly established cause and effect. Trying to bring about effects from causes that obviously are foreign to those effects can only end in turmoil, which pulls life apart rather than bringing its tremendous possibilities into sane and dependable relationship. Confidence in the people you do business with is worth money and worth health. Lack of confidence in people you are doing business with creates tension. Tension tightens up blood vessels, puts strain on the heart, and invites symptoms. Lack of confidence induces fear, and fear on its lower levels is a poison. Odd that a basic emotion should act at one time as a protector and at another as a poison. But so it is. That is why the ability to choose is such a boon. No doubt about it, the Creator provided us with an out in most contingencies, and thus left us the basis of freedom. All that is required of us is to develop the ability to choose well. The absence of intelligent education of the ego, the sure consequence of which leaves it to its own confused devices, would be like throwing an infant into a cage of wild animals expecting it to come out a poised, well-educated adult. Do we not really show evidence of treating a child as though he had a trained intelligence when we slap him or scream at him if he takes a sudden notion to push his cereal bowl over onto the floor? It is surely the problem of uneducated emotion in the parent, not an intentionally wicked action of the infant. The slap may be necessary if we find we are dealing with a strong ego, but not unless the slap is accompanied by a reasonable explanation of why it has occurred, is it without certain negative consequences, from momentary fear or rage to nervous habits of those two negatively reactive emotions. When the training of the ego is seriously neglected, the result can quite easily turn into the diametric reversal of the ego's natural purpose, to assist its owner into the deep satisfaction of excelling in the life process. As it is now, it can and does in a good many cases land an individual on the wrong side of the law. Results of that kind are not going to provide anyone with the prestige, power, and plenty anticipated by the ego. So something has caused its use of the power of choice to go wrong. But what about the will to win? Should we discourage such a valuable desire, which must be part of the process of succeeding? Do we not take great chances if we neglect this basic desire to win? Is it not true that desire must always be in the forefront of any effort to attain success? We could say yes, and leave the rest of the matter to luck, forgetting that we are complex organisms with a battery of capacities to call on. Success is a remarkable goal and should not be counted on if left only to a careless wish and a pallid hope. It is not hard to see the functional value of mental images in our lives. The two aspects of life, physical and emotional, have an influential relationship to each other. The emotional I want image precedes the physical results. The architect must have a specific picture of a house in his mind before he can possibly get it down on paper. The automobile designer works on paper from what we might call the visions he sees. Thus, we live by means of the production of images in our minds. So we cannot afford to think and act so disdainfully toward the importance of developing expertise in the use of images. We make a great fuss about the importance of education, and then dump the whole idea of living successfully on factual knowledge. And all the while we are really living in and from our feeling and our thought, with a lure of spiritual significance behind it all. If we have a true belief that a vital image in the mind must precede the attainment of a desire, we have something peculiarly effective to go on in the hope of fulfilling the desire. We cannot expect to have our wishes fall into our laps. Experience progresses by means of natural processes, to which we must relate ourselves. We must play by the rules, or everything goes helter-skelter. We must give repeated attention to the picture of a desire until the will is convinced it is a true one and lends its power to the job of bringing it into realization. Is it an unfair demand that we should be required to formulate and see in our minds an image of what we want? As a matter of fact, we already do this very thing, but often in such a vague, indolent way that the picture does not become crisp enough to summon the will to get to work and bring the desire into existence. The foremost need is to stir up that very essential power we were born with, the centrally useful ability of choice. Then pick out our goals and report our choice to basic desire to take care of the matter. People waste more time by expecting their freely given gifts of ability to tell them what to do, how to succeed, what interests them, and why. But it required the person, the boss, to decide. The individual must choose from his own abilities, hunt them out, compare them as to value, and examine them as to purpose and attraction in his own eyes and temperamental feeling. The power to choose is the pearl of great price in relating oneself to life and planning for success. What else could so raise the quality of humanity as for each and every one of us to desire passionately to be of value in life? It is understandable that man's magnificent capacities had to develop experimentally and grow with his own growth. Surely the capacity to grow is very nearly the crown of glory in the Creator's concept of what life could be, as it masters what we certainly have a right to call the miracle of spontaneous development. for it seems that we are on the brink of moving into the area of noumena. And there, in that luminous world of thought and feeling, it is quite conceivable that the possibilities for good will ultimately be able to supersede the threats of evil. The aim of self-expansion as the central drive of a human being is certainly consistent with social maturity. For can a person, yearning for expansion of his value to life, continue to expand in the direction of evil? It all depends on how rapidly the human race can learn to interpret meanings, the basic activity of the world of noumena. There is a firm evolutionary value in the concept, I want to prove to be worth something. Though man is tempted by evil impulses, he is also repelled by them. Conscience, the recognition of what is evil and what is good, is embedded in human consciousness. It is the ego's poorly conceived choices in the search for self-expansion that causes the leaning toward evil. The overall principle of self-expansion rests on the idea that there is room for everyone's attainment in an ever-expanding life process. But the education system should work more effectively on clarifying the fact that the universe and man's imagination present enough creative elements to justify the belief, the image, that life contains sufficient such elements to serve a self-expanding populace. If that populace would take the problem seriously, could it not find an encouraging substitute for a stubborn determination to produce and reproduce what could exterminate the human race? In the vernacular, how idiotic can we get? Dickering bodies of people and individuals must face the downright necessity of learning how to live in emotional balance. In other words, the human race needs to develop purpose enough and respect enough for the importance of that purpose to discover the point of balance that will produce the answer. It will never be recognized from a stance of logic, for logic knows nothing of love or wisdom. It is too cold and mechanical and useful only in an atmosphere of slide rules and logarithms. Love and wisdom are the very essence of such a stupendous hope. They are the true miracle of life, the only forces that can form the image in man's mind of an end to conflict, and start the determination to attain that end. We argue and argue until the atmosphere is blue, but in all this suffering time, while criminations and recriminations rattle around the world, we have left the noumenal essence of life, its soul, neglected and partially scorned. Thus, life has tended to stagnate into a childish hopscotch of deciding whose ego is brilliantly sly enough to score a win in the battle, not of self-expansion, but self-advertisement. That has been so far too victorious a portion of the progress of life, the winner being he whose ego, slyly enough and crassly enough, chooses to win personal power at any price. Constructive humility can induce an image in our minds, a valuable image of a balance between active purpose in our own progress towards self-expansion, plus sympathy for others in theirs. It should include self-protection, for that is necessary to protect self-expansion, plus a willingness to declare one's own error, if there is such to be admitted. There is generosity in the human being, a natural evolvement from the emotion of love, or we would not even have the word in our languages. There is pity in our hearts, not very well developed perhaps, because it gets sidetracked every day by ignorant misuse of our own emotions and the too clever ruses of the ego. The goals of our contemporary society do not seem to include much interest in the profound meanings of the word balance, and how it could be resurveyed as one of the more important principles in life. And of course, one is thinking of it as it influences the positive, constructive possibilities in the world of thought and feeling, the noumenal world of meaning and interpretation followed by action. In this life, without too clearly realizing it, we are slowly and painfully trying to bring the living of life into a balanced design. We are reaching for effective kindness, not the spoiling of incurably lazy people. We are hoping for muscular men capable of using muscle, both physical and mental, for the protection of the inadvertently helpless, and using mental strength to defeat con artists who prey on inexperience and neurosis and feed flattery to gullible vanity. But there are a good many of us who do not yet know the awkward positions the tricks of the ego can place us in. The ego has conveniences and services to offer the personality it inhabits, but it should never be assumed to be the whole person. Fortunately for us all, the ego recognizes the value of developing a reality relation to experience, but unfortunately, this is too often done in a spirit of self-interest only. It wants place and power, position and recognition. It struggles to have its own way and hopes to manage skillfully enough to get by in the social setup, but visualized a little more carefully than in mental images that include only a debonair or social skill. The ego badly needs training in how to avoid dragging the lower forces of the four basic emotions into life situations in order, as it inexpertly thinks, to foster self-expansion. This sets up a powerful conflict between a too-ready acceptance as gospel of the ways of the world and the deeper guidances from the innate wisdom of the soul. The barrier we find the most difficult to surmount is the almost irresistible temptation of the ego to use negative means to pilfer self-expansion from the lavish stores life holds for man to choose from. It is a real temptation, for its lure is predominantly based on one of the smartest traps for the lazy and clever mind. The negative method can tend to appear to be the easier one and produces its operators among those who can think quickly but seldom completely. Not completely enough to see jail is the possible result of their activity. We can unload a great deal of unhappy feeling by intentionally and insistently replacing it with common sense, sane acceptances, and sound, not wildly unfair, attitudes. Such a technique must start off on a forced basis, but if it is repeated often enough with positive intent, it will reach our subconscious mind and move that mighty power to change the situation. We can do a great deal more with thought than we have realized. When intelligence in this country moves to the point where it is recognized that the teaching of functional thinking, which superior minds tend to do automatically, should be a required subject in every school, the ego would then at last be rescued from its ignorance of how to think in consequences. That is, ahead of time. And this could reduce the population in the prisons to a more easily handled number. We have been learning a good deal about ourselves lately, and I mean, of course, about our inner selves, which are the most significant part of our claim to anything like meaning or significance. But the elements of the inner world are not visible to us as outer objects are. There is the difficulty, for how awfully and woefully those invisible elements can be felt, and how arbitrarily they push us from one area to another in the demanding realm of our own emotions. We are so full of feeling that it sometimes seems as though it would prevent our finding time and strength enough to learn how to handle it, or how to relieve ourselves of some of the many painful and puzzling difficulties it brings our way. A competitive policy in life is difficult to true up with a definite intention to pursue goals that are valuable to life, not destructive toward it. But it can be visualized and revisualized as we grow in knowledge and in intelligent handling of our emotions. We are not pleading for a termination of competitive effort, but for help in securing instruction for the young, based upon summum bonum, the highest good. We do not want a goody-goody world. We would like one in which every attribute of the individual developed positively, and every citizen came to know the difference between what is truly positive and what is unmitigatedly negative. In between lies a wide field of adjustment in the magnitude of human reaction. The harmless deceptions based on kindness, hard-fought winning of games, sincere and gladly received compliments, and so on and on. Our definition for the positive is what is for life at its ultimate greatest. What is truly negative is what is against life, because it retards its growth in value or degrades it. We should expect to give this process time, for that is an intrinsic factor of growth. We need time because we have only just begun to catch up in our job of understanding what needs to be done to clear the way to receive the bonus of the growth of joy. It comes with the deepening of self-knowledge and the amazing relief it can bring to our painfully limited understanding of ourselves and the weirdly uncomfortable experiences it can bring not to know more clearly who, why, and what we are. We survive from century to century on the basis of our capacity to grow in physical health and strength, mental vision, and spiritual understanding. If a nation neglects the striving for continual growth in every area and aspect of living, it deteriorates. It loses its position and power. We live by the images our thought and feeling create and offer to our wills to bring into being. The will watches these pictures as they form, and the mind sets to work to choose which ones to bring into existence and into excellence. As they prove up or fall fallow in execution, we observe, estimate, and correct our future choices. That is the kind of machines we are, how we work to produce an evolving history of living. The efficiency, quality, and meaning of our minds and bodies determine the reality and the success of our actions. Most of all, if our actions have no meaning, we devolve or remain stationary, meaningless and wasted. Until the type of catastrophe typically produced by the neurotic ego is fully recognized and a sincere effort to cure its neurotic habits is put to work, we shall be lured over and over again into the same time-wasting ways. Negatively obtained power does not desire and work for good. Such power works only for more power. The danger to life in this kind of evilly controlled power is what prompts us to suggest that only power used under the influence of the wisdom-love combination can hold the world steady and its people successful livers of life. Neurotic ego power is the antithesis of love. It is very probable that it loathes love except as it is confused with sexual indulgence, which must be admitted as basically an indulgence of the self. Love gives, and gives spontaneously to the thing loved. Sex becomes sullen if it does not get full satisfaction for itself. An overweening power drive could only look upon love as a frightening rival, capable possibly of defeating the chance for victory of the neurotic ego. For deep in its rapacious consciousness, it knows that love plus wisdom, the great authentic power combination in life, once established as monarch of our minds and emotions, would have an even chance in the battle against the worst disease man ever contracts, neurotic ego power. Growth is our one and only chance to end up with some sense of significance. This is perhaps why the ego's straying often from its own possible growth brings upon us disappointment, discouragement, and despair, or vacant minds and disabled bodies, to take the place of the charm, activity, and enthusiasm of youth. In such cases, the ego's owner has not chosen to take the pains to lead it into maturity with patience and hope, and the gathering of knowledge, so that it can bring its human embodiment into a self-expansion with which it can be satisfied. If the human race cannot think of its miraculous assets as effects of primal cause rather than as their own inventions, it could easily wallow forever in the misinterpretation and misuse of its own great endowments. A regeneration of our concept of self-respect could carry us forward in an important way. First, it is not self-flattery, for that robs man of his credibility. That attitude merely adds delay to our already delayed world. In the old days of dueling to prove a man's honor, many a fine man was sacrificed to a childish custom. It is not any claims to ancient lineage, relationship to people of importance, the amount of our yearly income, or the number of large enterprises on whose boards of directors we may serve, which spells out our right to self-respect. The proof of our value to life, and thus our right to self-respect, is gauged by the soundness, quality, and achievable purposes of our motives. Motives are the seeds of human action. Their purposes and methods could hardly be more important, and their reason for being is to direct the choice of our goals. In that way, they decide the effect of our lives upon all life and determine how life turns out, good, bad, or indifferent. Watch our motives and we have very nearly paid our dues to life. The concept Jesus so clearly declared when he said, "I can of mine own self do nothing. The Father that dwelleth in me, he doeth the works," is a notable declaration of simple constructive humility. It covers very effectively the question of what we are and where we come from. We certainly did not make the human body, or mind, or emotions, with their extraordinary functions and amazing possibilities. It is perhaps one of the most blatant pieces of arrogance humanity is capable of that anyone would claim or believe that he was the inventor of a human body or the capacity to think. If we can get even a fleeting glimpse of the possible rewards to be found by relating ourselves to life at some of its most significant points, it may stir up interest enough to try for self-mastery over our ego and our emotions. It can be done, gradually. We cannot ask it to happen overnight, not in anything as complicated and gifted as the miracle we are. The more we become acquainted with our full identity, the more we will be willing to surrender our ego to the deeper realities of our spiritual nature. You listened. Self-Mastery by David SEABURY. Audiobook edition 2023 by David DeAngelis. All rights are reserved.